Always good to see you, sir. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be with you.
On my colleague Joy Reid's show, she made some pretty strong accusations about the Chief of Staff. Is this feud just getting out of hand, or do you think she's right? Does Mr. Kelly owe her an apology?
Well, I do believe he owes her apology, but we also need to understand that Kelly lost his son. There is an enormous tragedy that's occurring across these decades in America as we've been at war. Americans have been killed in war. Most recently, these four Green Berets in Niger. And that's heart-wrenching, and that's the underlying tragedy. Yes, Kelly was out of line. He was wrong. And he does owe an apology. Doesn't have to be done publicly, but he really ought to be phoning Frederica and saying, listen, I'm sorry, we've got to get back to the reality. This fellow was killed. My son was killed. We need to understand that. Beyond that, we've got a president that is clearly out of line. His entire political history, beginning with his campaign, has been really centered on his reaching out and demeaning people personally, calling people names throughout the Republican primary campaign, calling people names, and continuing on to this very day. That is no way for the President of the United States to behave. It is outlandish behavior, and he needs to tone it down and realize that he is the leader of this nation, the leader of what we used to call the free world, the strongest country in the world. This is not how the president should be acting.
Well, I have to say I agree with you, because when John Kelly spoke about losing his own son in Afghanistan, it was heartfelt, it was eloquent,
sure.
And I think you could have heard a pin drop. Everybody empathized with him, and yet all this subsequent noise. In fact, let's play another interview, clip from my colleague Joy Reid's interview with the Congresswoman this morning. Let's take a look at this together.
This is going to be Trump's Benghazi, Trump's Niger, and they need to concentrate on what happened, and what is happening. Why was LaDavid separated from the rest of his battalion? Why was LaDavid found almost a mile away? Why was he not in an armored truck?
All questions which have yet to be answered, sir. Do you agree? Is this going to be Mr. Trump's Benghazi? I mean, do you hear from your Democrats who are echoing similar sentiments?
I don't know, but I do know the Benghazi investigations really diverted the attention of America from the fundamentals. And I'm thinking here increasingly that the president is nothing but a huckster at the state fair with a bunch of walnut shells and a pea beneath it. We have an extraordinarily important thing before the American public today, and that is this Republican tax cut, which is somewhere around $5 trillion of reduced revenue to the federal government. In their own estimate, it's going to increase the deficit. The deficit hawks seem to have disappeared, but I'm afraid they're in remission. If they're successful at cutting the taxes by that amount, they're going to go after the programs that Americans depend upon. And in the House budget, there is somewhere near a $2 trillion reduction in Medicare and Medicaid. We need to focus on that. We can't continue to be bamboozled by the shells being moved. Where is that P? The P is actually these tax cuts, which are now moving forward in Congress with the Democrats not even being able to be at the negotiating table. They're going to run this through on a 51 vote in the Senate, and they certainly can do it in the House also.
Well, clearly you bring up situations worthy of discussion and grave concern, but even before we get there, the investigation into Niger continues.
Sure.
The White House says, look, we're not going to talk about this because the investigation is continuing. Is that standard operating procedure, or do you sense there's anything different about this particular incident?
Well, the actual details of what happened during the firefight, that does take a while to do it. But the overarching question is, what are we doing in Niger? Actually, Frederica Wilson did a pretty good job this morning in her interview laying out the history. We do know that when Libya collapsed, many very violent extreme organizations moved out of Libya into the Sahara and into the Sahel, which is the southern Sahara. And they have been raising hell in that area. The abduction of the 270 young women, one example. That was Boko Haram. In Niger, the exact same thing. thing is going on with another subgroup. And yes, the French and the United States are in that area. For the most part, we're supposed to be training the Nigerian soldiers and police. We are also building a major airfield in northern Niger from which the French and the United States are going to be conducting air operations in that area. All of this is very well known. It's public record, not focused on by the American public and frankly not by many in Congress.
And I'm curious, sir, because we were told by Senator Lindsey Graham when speaking with a group of reporters on Friday that the U.S. presence, the footprint there in Africa overall is on the uptick. Were you aware of that? Was that the first you'd heard of it?
Absolutely. My wife and I were Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia years ago, and we paid attention to Africa over the years. That broad swath, all the way from Somalia through Ethiopia into southern Sudan, across Chad, Nigeria, and Niger, and even further west, that is a very, very dangerous area where there are violent extreme organizations of various cults and types who are waging war against the established governments in that area. Not that the governments are perfect, they're not. These organizations nearly took over Chad not so long ago, pushed back by the overall assistance of many governments in that area, African governments actually, as well as the assistance of the United States and the French. It is a very dangerous area. It is and will continue to be the breeding ground for various violent extreme organizations that will attempt to reach beyond Africa into Europe and quite possibly into the Western Hemisphere. So yes, we do need to pay attention to it. Those of us that are on the Armed Services Committee are well aware of what's going on in that area.
And it is a sobering discussion that we have relative to that, sir. Representative John Garamendi, thank you so much for your time as always.
Thank you.
Coming up, why Republicans are looking for revenge in Mississippi and turning to Steve Bannon to deliver.